The orbital station floated in silence above the blue-gray planet, a massive ring of steel and glass suspended between the void of space and the burning atmosphere below. From a distance it looked perfect, shining like a crown of light against the darkness. But inside its walls, tension pressed heavier than the artificial gravity. Humans and aliens had gathered here for talks that no one truly trusted. Each step in the endless corridors carried unease. Every word passed through translators was wrapped in suspicion. It was a fragile peace, and everyone knew how easily it could shatter. Eli was not a diplomat. He had no polished uniform or heavy words to throw across tables. He was a maintenance engineer, a man who worked in the background, his hands more comfortable with wires and circuits than politics. Still, he had been summoned to the Great Hall to check the neural relay system, a complex machine that allowed minds to bridge language and thought. Without it, the talks would fall into chaos. He walked into the chamber quietly, his toolpack slung over his shoulder, eyes drifting over the tall windows that framed the endless void outside. On the other side of the chamber stood Kira, an envoy of her people. Her kind moved with grace, tall figures with a calm aura that contrasted sharply with the sharp voices of the human officials. She was here as a symbol of hope, though Eli could tell from her tense posture that she carried the same doubts everyone else did. Their eyes met only for a second, a brief acknowledgement, two strangers who had no reason to think their paths would cross again. For Eli, she was just another face among the crowd, one more reminder of how wide and strange the galaxy truly was. Hall was filled with quiet murmurs as the system powered on. The neural relay stood at the center, a cluster of crystalline nodes glowing faintly, wires stretching like veins across the floor. It was meant to be safe, controlled, but Eli had worked with these systems long enough to know that machines did not always obey their makers. He crouched near the console, checking readings, listening to the steady hum. All seemed normal. He gave a small nod to the officials, signaling that the device was ready. Then he stepped back, content to fade into the background once again. But the universe had other plans. The lights flickered once, then again, sharper this time. The hum of the relay grew into a harsh buzz, the crystal nodes pulsing too fast. Too bright. Eli's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He rushed forward, reaching for the manual shutdown, but he was too late. A surge of raw energy burst through the room like lightning. The air cracked with light, a soundless roar that filled every mind present. People staggered back, clutching their heads. Eli felt himself thrown off balance, his chest tightening as the energy struck him. At the same moment, across the chamber, Kira collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against her temples as the same surge slammed into her. For a heartbeat, the world disappeared. Eli was no longer in his body. He was floating in darkness, a void without form or sound. Then came a voice that was not his own, soft yet clear, trembling with shock. He did not hear it with his ears, he felt it inside his thoughts. The words formed directly in his mind. Who is there? He wanted to answer, but his mouth would not move. Instead, his thoughts spilled out without control. What is happening to me? And then he realized with terror that whoever was speaking could hear him as clearly as he could hear them. The darkness shattered, and Eli opened his eyes. He was lying on the cold floor of the hall, chest heaving, his palms raw where he had braced his fall. People were shouting around him, but their voices were distant, muffled, meaningless. What consumed him was the sudden awareness of another mind brushing against his own. He turned his head and saw Kira, her eyes wide, staring at him with the same confusion and fear. He knew she was hearing him, just as he was hearing her. Not through sound, not through the translator, but directly. Every flicker of thought, every surge of panic, it was all there between them. Eli scrambled to his knees, his breath unsteady. He wanted to block it out, to shove the intruder from his mind, but there was no door to close. The connection clung like chains, binding thought to thought, fear to fear. Kira pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself. Her lips moved, as if she were trying to speak aloud, but then her voice echoed again inside his head, raw and uncertain. This should not be possible. The link is wrong. It should not bind strangers. Eli answered without wanting to, his thoughts spilling into her. I don't understand any of this. The officials rushed to them, demanding explanations, but Eli barely heard. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. His own private mind, the one place no one had ever touched, was no longer his own. And worse, he felt not just words but emotions spilling across the link: her fear, her anger, her fierce determination to stand even when the world tried to crush her. She, in turn, would be feeling him, his confusion, his instinct to fix what was broken, his disbelief at being so suddenly exposed. Two strangers who had barely exchanged a glance now stood with their souls tangled together in ways no one had ever intended. And in the silence between the shouts and flashing alarms, both Eli and Kira felt the same truth, heavy and undeniable. Whatever had happened here was no accident. The bond was real, and it was not fading. Their lives, once separate, had been forced into collision, and neither of them could see a way back. The chamber was still in chaos when Eli pulled himself upright, but all the sound around him seemed far away and hollow. The voices of the officials, the warnings of the guards, the sharp orders crackling through the intercom, none of it mattered compared to the steady pulse that was not his own heartbeat echoing inside his skull. Every flicker of thought in his mind brushed against another presence, one that resisted and trembled at the same time. He turned his head and his gaze met Kira's across the room. Her eyes were fixed on him, not with recognition, but with something sharper, a mixture of alarm and disbelief. As though she were staring at a reflection she did not want to see. They were both carried out of the hall under the watch of worried medics and security officers. But wherever Eli went, he could feel her there, as if her shadow followed him inside his own mind. When he sat on the medical cot in the bright white infirmary, trying to steady his breathing, he did not have to wait for a doctor to speak before he knew Kira had been brought to the other side of the room. Her discomfort bled into him in small sharp waves, her thoughts leaking in fragments that neither of them could control. He pressed his palms hard against his face, wishing he could shut it all out, but the more he tried to push her away, the stronger the link seemed to grow. The doctors performed scans, the machines buzzing around his head, and the officials demanded explanations, but no one had an answer that made sense. The neural relay system had been damaged by the surge, and none of the readings explained why a link had formed between two people who had never been prepared or conditioned for such contact. Neural links were supposed to be precise and limited, temporary bridges to share basic thoughts for translation. They were never meant to bind whole minds together. Eli could feel the fear of the medical staff and the way they hesitated to approach, their eyes darting nervously toward Kira, as though she were carrying some unknown infection. Yet he knew that whatever had happened was inside him too, and there was no cure they could simply cut away. The hours stretched, and the weight of the bond became heavier. Whenever Eli tried to close his eyes, memories not his own slipped through brief flashes of an alien city made of spiraling towers, the sound of a low wind whistling through stone arches, the echo of a song sung in a language he had never heard. He flinched and opened his eyes, but the images lingered like aftershadows. He turned his head and found Kira watching him from across the room, her hands clenched tightly as though holding herself together. He realized she must be seeing his memories as well, the dusty alleys of his childhood, the endless hours he had spent bent over broken machines in the engine bays, the dull ache of loneliness he had carried for years. The thought of someone else seeing those private pieces of him made his stomach twist. The officials brought them together at last, forcing them into a smaller chamber under heavy guard. Eli wanted to protest, to demand to be left alone, but even before he opened his mouth, he heard Kira's thoughts slide against his own, quiet and bitter. They think we can explain this. They think we chose it. He did not answer aloud. Instead, his thoughts slipped back in a rush. I didn't choose this any more than you did. She flinched as though his words had struck her, her lips pressing thin, and he felt her frustration crackle like static against his mind. Hours of forced questioning followed, but neither of them could explain more than the others already knew. The link was unstable yet unbreakable, carrying not only thoughts but emotions in waves neither of them could control. When Eli grew angry at the official's tone, Kira felt the heat rise in her own chest. When Kira's worry spiked at the memory of her people depending on her, Eli's stomach clenched with the same sharp edge of fear. They were no longer separate witnesses. They were tangled together in a way no one else in the chamber could begin to understand. When the officials finally left, muttering about containment and research, the silence between Eli and Kira stretched long and heavy. For a moment neither of them spoke, but the bond made silence impossible. She finally stood, her tall frame pacing the room, and her voice came into his mind like a whisper. Dragged against stone, you are human. You cannot hold this link. Your kind was never trained for it. It will break you. Eli clenched his fists, answering without meaning to. If it breaks me, it breaks you too. We are tied together now, whether you want it or not. She stopped pacing and turned sharply to him, her eyes narrowed, and he felt the flare of her temper, as clearly as the pounding of his own heart. But beneath her anger was fear, and Eli knew it was not only for herself. She carried the weight of representing her people, of showing strength in front of humans who already doubted her kind. To appear weak, to appear broken by a human connection, was something she could not allow. And Eli, though he had no great duty beyond fixing machines, felt the sting of that fear as though it were his own. In that moment, he realized that the bond was not just a curse. It was a window, raw and unwanted, but a window that made lies impossible. For the first time he could see her not as an envoy in a polished chamber, but as a person struggling under pressure that never let up. Before either of them could settle with that thought, alarms suddenly rang across the station, harsh and urgent. Red light swept through the walls, and the intercom barked warnings of sabotage in the reactor wing. Eli froze, the words sharp enough to slice through his fog of confusion. He could feel Kira's pulse quicken in time with his own. This was no accident, no random failure. Someone had chosen this moment of weakness to strike. The guards rushed out, leaving the two of them alone. Eli felt the heavy weight of the bond twist again, pulling his thoughts toward hers, and for the first time he did not fight it. Her fear met his fear, and with it came a strange steadiness, as though together their scattered thoughts formed something stronger. He rose to his feet and looked at her, his voice steady not because of his own courage, but because he could feel hers echoing within him. If this station goes down, we go down with it, he said, his words low but firm. And though she did not answer with her mouth, he felt her agreement ripple through the link, a silent vow that bound them tighter than any oath spoken aloud. They had barely known each other, yet in that moment, they both understood that survival would depend on what they could become together. The alarms kept echoing through the station like a heartbeat gone wild, red lights flashing in long pulses that painted the steel walls with a sense of urgency no one could ignore. Eli felt the vibration of boots running across the corridor outside, and the muffled shouts of soldiers rallying toward the reactor wing. He did not need the intercom to tell him how serious the danger was, because the station's power core was not just a machine that kept lights glowing. It was the very heart that kept the orbital ring alive. If it failed or if it was destroyed by hostile hands, the firestorm would swallow every soul within these walls and scatter pieces of metal into orbit forever. Kira stood rigid by the door, her tall frame tense like a drawn bow. Through the bond, Eli felt her fear sharpen into focus, but he also felt her training take over, her mind turning toward order and command. She had been raised to hold composure in crisis, and now that steel strength pressed into his thoughts. For the first time since the accident, Eli welcomed the bond, because without it, he would have been trembling with uncertainty. But with her resolve in his mind, his own fear was steadied into something usable. He rose from his seat and adjusted the strap of his tool pack, the weight of it familiar against his side, a reminder that his hands had been made to fix broken systems, even in the middle of chaos. When the guards returned for them, their orders were brief. The relay malfunction had created something dangerous, but right now there was no time to study or question. Every capable hand was needed to prevent the sabotage from reaching its end. Eli and Kira were escorted quickly through winding corridors, their footsteps echoing in rhythm. All the while the bond pressed deeper, making it impossible to hide stray emotions. Eli caught glimpses of her memory, flashes of her childhood under a sky filled with twin moons, her people gathering in circles of song and ritual, her burden of carrying not just her voice, but the weight of generations who wanted peace. Kira in turn caught pieces of him that he wished she had not seen, the loneliness of nights spent working alone in empty bays, the sting of being overlooked because he was not a soldier or a leader, the quiet yearning for something that felt larger than himself. Neither spoke aloud, but the silence between them was alive with unspoken truth. They were no longer strangers, though they had barely known each other before. The link peeled away every barrier, leaving them raw, leaving them unable to pretend. The sabotage was worse than Eli expected. When they reached the reactor wing, the air was already thick with smoke and the sharp tang of burnt metal. Soldiers fought to secure the outer corridors, while engineers scrambled to seal bulkheads. Eli's eyes went immediately to the console on the reactor's outer ring, the screens flashing with unstable readings. Whoever had planted the disruption knew exactly where to strike, because the failsafes were scrambled and the emergency cutoff lines were severed. If the reactor overheated, the entire station would go down. Eli rushed forward, his hands moving over the console with instinct, but his mind was not alone. Kira stood behind him, her sharp eyes following every move, and through the bond he felt, her instincts pressing against his own. Her training was not in machines, but in strategy, in reading patterns, in anticipating the moves of those who wanted destruction. As Eli traced the corrupted lines of code through the system, Kira's thoughts guided him, showing him angles he would not have considered, revealing how the saboteurs had layered their interference to trap engineers in false readings. There, minds moved together, not perfectly at first, but enough that progress came faster than Eli had ever worked alone. Yet with every shared thought came something deeper. In the middle of fighting against the system, Eli felt her exhaustion from years of diplomacy, her quiet fear of failing her people, her hidden wish to be free from the endless chains of duty. And Kira felt his determination burn like a steady flame, a simple man who had never asked for greatness yet could not turn away from what needed to be done. In that merging of minds, something fragile but powerful grew, something beyond survival, a trust that neither had chosen, but both now carried. The attackers struck again before the repairs were complete. Explosions shook the lower decks and the sound of metal tearing filled the corridors. Soldiers shouted as enemy infiltrators pushed closer, their weapons leaving sparks along the walls. Eli ducked as the shockwave rattled the console, but Kira stepped forward with a swiftness that surprised him, seizing a discarded rifle from the ground. She moved with precision, her tall frame braced like a wall, firing down the corridor in bursts that forced the enemy back. Eli felt her focus sharpen like a blade, every decision flashing across the bond before her hands moved, and he realized he was anticipating her actions almost before she made them. Their connection was no longer just thoughts, it was reflex, it was rhythm. It was the strange harmony of two people becoming more than separate bodies. But the cost was heavy. The deeper they pushed into each other's minds, the more the line between them blurred. Eli felt her anger as though it were his own, the heat of battle burning in his chest. She felt his determination to protect the console, even if it meant breaking himself, and it pressed into her heart with painful clarity. Their individuality trembled at the edges, threatening to dissolve into a single stream, and both of them knew the danger. The doctors had warned that untrained minds could collapse under such strain. Yet here they were, using it like a weapon and a shield in the middle of a battlefield. When the attackers finally pulled back and the corridor fell into a tense silence, Eli slumped against the console, his breath ragged. The system showed signs of stabilization. The overheating slowed, but it was not finished. Kira crouched beside him, her weapon resting at her side, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made him look away. Yet through the bond there was no escape. He could feel her gratitude pressing against his mind, a wordless warmth that unsettled him more than the enemy fire had. He tried to push it aside, focusing on the wires beneath his hands, but the truth remained. He was no longer fighting only for the station, he was fighting for her as well. For the bond that neither of them had chosen, but both of them now carried with the weight of survival. And in the stillness that followed, Eli realized with both dread and wonder that this unwanted bond was no longer only a curse. It was becoming something else, something stronger, something that might change not only the outcome of this battle, but the path of their lives forever. The station groaned as though it were alive, the steel frame shuddering with every explosion that echoed through its endless corridors. The red lights that had begun as warnings now burned with an almost constant glare, bathing every shadow in a blood-colored haze. The reactor still pulsed with unstable energy, the readings on the console trembling between safety and disaster, and Eli knew the saboteurs would not stop until the core was pushed past the point of no return. He felt sweat run down his back, his fingers moving quickly over the systems, but even his practiced hands shook as the weight of the moment pressed down harder than any tool he had ever carried. Kira stood beside him like a sentinel, her eyes never leaving the entrance to the reactor wing. The bond carried the steady rhythm of her focus into Eli's mind, wrapping around his frantic thoughts and forcing them into order. She had fought before. She had stared into chaos without letting it consume her, and now that calm determination was the only thing that kept him from giving in to panic. When the sound of approaching footsteps echoed again through the corridor, Eli flinched, but Kira's stance shifted with quiet readiness, and he felt her certainty seep into him. Together they braced themselves for the final wave. The enemy came with ferocity. Armored figures burst through the smoke, their weapons blazing, their shouts sharp against the roar of failing machinery. Kira moved first, stepping forward with swift precision, her rifle steady as she cut down the nearest attackers. Eli felt each of her movements as though they were his own muscles pulling, her focus flooding into him in quick bursts. He ducked at the exact moment she knew he should, turned toward the console the instant her mind pushed him to act. They were no longer two separate fighters. They were one rhythm, one pulse, reacting faster than thought could carry. Yet the bond carried more than strategy. As the battle raged, Eli felt the burn of her anger at those who sought to destroy everything she had worked for. He felt the pain of loss from memories she had never meant to share, the faces of comrades who had fallen in wars long past, the crushing silence of standing alone as her people demanded strength from her. It surged into him until his chest ached with it, but it did not break him. Instead it became fuel, because in return, Kira felt his stubborn resolve. The deep human refusal to let despair win, the small but steady fire of someone who had always fixed what others thought was beyond repair. Their emotions collided and merged, forming something that neither of them could have summoned alone. The saboteurs pushed harder, some reaching the console with knives and tools meant for sabotage rather than battle. Eli's hands flew faster, cutting wires and rerouting power even as sparks rained down. Through the bond he felt Kira's sharp warning before danger reached him, her instincts pulling his body into motion a heartbeat before a blade could strike. He dropped to the floor, rolled to the side, and slammed his hand against the emergency override she pushed into his thoughts. Together they held the line, every move shared, every breath mirrored. But the cost was tearing at them. The link, already unstable, deepened with every passing second until Eli could not tell where his thoughts ended and hers began. He felt himself drowning in her willpower, her duty, her fire, while she was overwhelmed by his raw determination and his desperate need to save not just the station, but her as well. Their identities blurred, flickering at the edges, threatening to dissolve into a single stream of thought. It frightened him, yet he knew they could not afford to pull back, not when the reactor's core screamed with rising instability. A final explosion shook the deck, the saboteurs detonating charges. In a last attempt to breach the reactor, the shockwave hurled both Eli and Kira against the wall, the console sparking violently. Eli's vision blurred, blood trickling from his forehead, but through the haze he felt Kira's thoughts pour into him with fierce clarity. We cannot fail. Together or not at all. Her words were not just in his mind. They were his own voice echoing with hers, their determination fused into one. He forced himself to his knees, his hands diving back into the tangle of wires, while she rose and charged forward, her weapon blazing until the last saboteur fell silent. The corridor was filled with smoke, the air thick with the stench of burnt metal and blood, but Eli ignored it all. Guided by Kira's sharp instincts, he bypassed the sabotage systems and rerouted the power manually, his hands moving faster than they ever had. Every connection he made, every line he sealed, was reinforced by her presence pressing against his mind, showing him the path he might have missed. At last he slammed his palm against the final control, and the reactor's screams settled into a steady hum. The readings stabilized, the alarms slowed, and for the first time since the chaos began, hope returned to the station. But the price of their victory was written across their faces. Eli collapsed against the console, his chest heaving, his vision swimming. Kira stumbled toward him, her steps heavy, her rifle clattering to the floor. The bond between them burned with such intensity that it was almost unbearable. Their minds still fused in a way that felt less like sharing and more like merging. Eli could no longer tell which thoughts were his own. He heard her memories whispering with the same clarity as his, felt her emotions pounding through his heart as though it had always been that way. He looked up at her and found her staring back, her expression raw, her eyes wide with the same fear and wonder he felt. For a moment, there was no station, no smoke, no war, only the undeniable truth that they had become something different in that battle, something neither of them had chosen but could no longer deny. The bond had not broken under strain, it had deepened, pulling them dangerously close to losing themselves as individuals. And though the reactor was safe, though the enemies were defeated, the question that now hung between them was more terrifying than the threat of destruction. Would they survive as two people bound together, or had they already begun to become one? The silence that followed the battle was heavy but different from the silence before. It was not the silence of fear or the silence of waiting. It was the silence of survival. The alarms dimmed one by one until only the steady hum of the reactor filled the air, a hum that now sounded almost like a heartbeat echoing through the steel bones of the station. The smoke drifted upward in lazy swirls, The fires that had threatened to consume everything reduced to glowing embers. Soldiers moved through the corridors with weary steps, checking for wounded, pulling wreckage aside, their voices low and tired. For the first time since the sabotage began, the orbital ring held steady, alive against all odds. Eli sat slumped by the console, his body bruised and aching, but his hands still resting on the machine as if it might collapse if he dared to let go. His head throbbed with exhaustion and blood clung to the side of his face, but what consumed him most was not his injuries. It was the bond that still pulsed inside him, burning with a strange energy that refused to fade. Kira knelt nearby, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths, her weapon discarded, her eyes fixed on him. Through the bond he felt her fatigue mirror his own, every ache doubled, every flicker of relief shared, as if their bodies and minds had forgotten where one ended and the other began. Medics rushed in and tried to separate them, pulling Eli toward a stretcher, but the moment they touched him, he felt the bond twist violently, a sharp pull that tore through his chest. Kira gasped at the same time, her hand flying to her temple as though someone had struck her. The medics froze, startled, then stepped back as they realized the truth. No machine or medical restraint could undo what had been forged between these two. The neural link had bound them too deeply, fusing pathways that were never meant to touch. To tear them apart now would not only wound their minds, it might kill them both. So they were left together, side by side, carried through the station. Not as separate patients, but as one strange and unexplainable unit. Wherever Eli went, Kira was near, and wherever she walked, Eli felt the pull that kept him tethered to her. Officials whispered as they passed, diplomats frowned with suspicion, and scientists argued over what it meant, but none of that mattered. To Eli in that moment, what mattered was the steady awareness of her presence in his mind, not overwhelming now, but constant, like a thread woven through his thoughts. Time blurred as the fires were put out and the station slowly calmed. In the days that followed, Eli and Kira were placed under observation, but the bond remained unchanged. It no longer screamed with chaotic intensity as it had in the battle, but it refused to vanish. They could sense each other even when they sat in silence across the room. They could feel emotions ripple through without words. They could share memories without meaning to. At first it frightened Eli, the idea that he might never again be alone inside his own head. But the longer he lived with it, the more he realized that loneliness was something he had carried all his life, and now it had been replaced by something different, something strange but no longer unbearable. Kira struggled as well, though she did not admit it aloud. Her people expected strength, distance, and dignity, yet the bond had stripped her of all walls. Ayla had seen the raw parts of her heart, the weight of her duty, the grief she had never shown anyone else. At first she resisted it, holding herself stiff and guarded, but slowly she began to see that he was not her enemy, not her rival, not even just her ally. He was simply there, sharing the burden without demanding anything in return, carrying pieces of her pain as if it were his own because the bond allowed no other choice. And for someone who had always carried the world alone, that quiet companionship was something she did not know she had needed until it was there. The officials pressed them with questions, demanding to know what they had learned from each other. What secrets had been passed through the link, what advantage could be gained. But Eli and Kira both gave the same answer. There were no secrets to steal, no advantage to exploit. What had grown between them was not a weapon or a tool, it was simply connection, raw and unshaped, something beyond the reach of politics. And though the officials were frustrated, they could not deny that the link had saved the station, for without it the reactor would have fallen and the orbital ring would now be drifting in ruins. One evening, long after the last of the damage had been repaired and the station's corridors were filled again with calm light, Eli found himself standing by one of the great windows, the planet below stretching wide and silent. The stars burned cold beyond it, scattered in endless patterns, and for a moment he felt very small, a single human surrounded by infinities. But then he felt her presence at his side, her quiet breath echoing in his thoughts, and the smallness faded. He turned and saw her watching the same view, her expression calm. Her eyes softened in a way they had not been in the chamber on the first day they met. Through the bond he felt her thought rise, not in words but in a wave of emotion that spoke more clearly than language. Gratitude, respect, and something deeper, fragile but real. He answered not with speech but with the steady warmth of his own thoughts, letting her feel what he could not easily say. He had not asked for this bond, he had not wished for it. Yet now he could not imagine returning to the silence that had filled his mind before. They had barely known each other once, strangers, on opposite sides of a fragile truce, but now they were bound by something greater than choice. They were bound by survival, by shared pain, by trust forged in fire. When the council met again, the humans and Kira's people looked at the two of them not as diplomats or soldiers, but as proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged, proof that connection was not always built through agreements or treaties, but sometimes through accident, through struggle, through the raw, unplanned collision of lives. And as the talk slowly shifted toward peace, Eli and Kira remained side by side, not because they had been ordered to, but because neither could imagine standing apart. The bond would remain, fragile yet unbreakable, a thread that stretched between two hearts that had once been strangers. And though the future was uncertain, though the galaxy still carried wars and dangers, they knew that whatever came they would not face it alone. For in the silence after the chaos, in the hum of the station's heartbeat, they had discovered something that no machine had ever been built to create. They had discovered that even across worlds, even across species, the most human thing of all was the connection that made two lives become more than they had been before. The end.